I want to talk about cognitive behavior and psychiatric issues and responses. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit different today, and I hope it doesn't fall completely flat, because I'm actually really not going to talk very much about the science itself. I'm going to show you a few things, but my mission today is to show you how, after about 12 years of my work on this disorder and about 6 years here at the Mind Institute, we're beginning to step things up to a whole new level and try to understand the sources of variation and where we might begin to understand why some of the things are happening that are happening beyond what we've already done, and integrate those relationships together and see if we can identify subgroups with different kinds of outcomes, start to move towards treatments, and get into some of those variable issues. So I'm going to just sort of dip quickly between a few things. Some of you who've been here before have heard me talk about the work that we've been doing, and this is what most of our research has been funded for up to date now, is research on the issues of space and time limitations in children who have the 22q11.2 deletion. We tend not to use the VCF, velocardiofacial syndrome label, or the DeGeorge label for reasons that I don't have time to go into now, but basically the 22q11 is the accurate genetic disorder label and doesn't bias to certain specific kinds of features. And if you have a doctor who doesn't know much about this and you say, well, you know, my child has DeGeorge is defined by 4 things, and they may look some of those 4 things up and say, you know, your child hasn't any of those, that's not it. So, but there's a whole other discussion, and that one of the things about that 22q at the zoo day is to try to be part of what's called the same name campaign, that everyone try to stick with one name so we get less confused about all of this. But the whole point here is that we've been working on the idea about spatial and temporal impairments because of the impact that they can have on learning about very important things. One of the most obvious ones is numbers, which is a very important thing for people to learn in this society. You can't really get to places on time, and you can't make change, and you can't do a lot of things in the everyday world if you can't deal with numbers. And so that's been a very important aspect of that. And our basic research has really developed some really important, I think, explanations about why these things are happening. And that is now something that we've been advancing towards the development of an intervention for, and I want to show you that really quickly if I can get everything rolling again. But also, one of the things that's important about that is that when you're struggling with difficulties, understanding space, how to get from one place to another, and time, how long did this take? Where am I in time? You know, what is basically the idea of time and how to think about it? That those kinds of difficulties can make life complicated and hard for you when you're struggling with those kinds of complications. And we're going to show you what it's like today at some point when Ingrid does her talk later on, about how dealing with those difficulties can be stressful. And so resolving some of those learning difficulties can themselves be important ways to reduce stress and anxiety. So the intervention is not only something that will be planned to address that specific issue, but hopefully will have maybe less immediately measurable impacts on things like stress and anxiety, but hopefully they will impact that as well. So the basic idea is that the theoretical position that I've developed, that seems to explain quite a lot of our data, is that trying to think about numbers is really based on thinking about space and time in the beginning. And the reason for that is that space and time are abstract quantities. If I asked you how much space is in this room, you know, it's a very hard thing to think about. I could tell you how many square feet it was if I knew. But, you know, that's a concept that's kind of an indirect measurement of it. So space and time have a scale to them. And that scale is very hard to think about in really abstract terms. So we, as human beings, we actually have to learn what those things mean. So we use mental units to break them up meaningfully. We have to learn through childhood what an inch or a second or a foot or an hour really means. And numbers were invented by human beings to talk about how much stuff we have. So the problem is, what if your mental units don't match the world? It's going to be very hard to understand the concepts that people are talking about and that you have to learn. That's going to make it very hard to learn about concepts such as 4 or 5 or 6. And also before and after, and bigger and smaller, and all those other kinds of things. So my analogy that I've used, it's a bit like having a digital camera. Most people have a digital camera now. If you think about an old-fashioned digital camera and a very modern one that's very high resolution, if you take a picture of an exactly identical picture with 2 cameras, load them up on the same computer and try to zoom in to make a fine distinction, you can see the whole image in the picture. But if I say, is this thing bigger than that thing, and it's a small difference, you may not be able to see that. Okay, so you just can't actually even comprehend what's going on. And this is because of a phenomenon we call crowding. It's not a problem of vision, it's a problem of the way our mental representation uses information that we get from our eyes. And this explanation is the basis of a novel intervention that we're developing. And I kept saying on previous meetings, this is my slide from last year, I said if only we could get the money to build these, we would build them. I'm submitting a grant in 2 weeks to actually try to move this forward. So I want to show you what crowding is, okay? I'm going to put a slide up in a moment, and it's a white screen, and there's a cross over here. And some of you have seen this before, it still works even if you have. I want you to look at the cross over here and not move your eyes, okay? Here we go. Now keep your eyes fixed on the cross. You are aware of some bars on the other side of the screen, right? Without moving your eyes, you want to yell out how many bars there are? 4. Oh, we got some disagreement. Okay. Go take a look. So you notice that you couldn't actually tell. Most people said 4 because they get crowded together and you lose access to some of them. So if you have crowding in your attentional capabilities, which is actually what directs your eyes, then you can't actually get access to all the information. You lose stuff. Now this looks like a kind of a laboratory experiment, all right? I'm going to show you another one, how this really works in the real world. On the next slide, there's a naturalistic scene, and there's a black and white bullseye right in the middle of the screen. I want you to find that bullseye as quickly as you can and fix your eyes on the bullseye. It basically simulates somebody driving a car down the street. Ready? Fix your eyes on that bullseye. See it right there. Okay, now keep your eyes fixed there. How many kids do you see running in the street? 2. Okay, the people up front have a slightly closer access to this, but notice now if you take your eyes away from that, most of you probably missed this kid right here. Because of crowding, okay? There's crowded information. It's similar, it's overlapping in features, it's squashed together. This child has no crowding information, and you can see him, I guess, pretty easily. If you were driving down the street and that child ran through there, you may never see that child. Okay? That's crowding in the real world situation. And that, if you have that phenomenon impacting all of your visual scene, then you actually might lose some information. And so if I show you 5 things and you can't tell whether that's 4 things or 6 things, that's going to be very, very hard for you to actually deal with. It turns out that the kids who we've studied with the 22q deletion are in pink. They're 7 to 14 years of age. These are typical kids of the same age. And this is an estimated capacity of how many things are being tracked. And it turns out that most kids can handle a bit less than 1 when there's really 1 object there, so they're mostly correct. And then typical kids, whether they're going slow or whether they're going fast, the faster they go, the more crowding there can be. They're still doing quite well for 2 objects, but they lose a little bit of accuracy when it gets to 3. You can see that kids with 22q deletion hang on quite well for 1. They really start to drop off at 2, and by the time you get to 3, they've pretty much fallen completely off. So their capacity of carrying things in their mind is reduced because of crowding. And so what can you do about this? Well, it turns out that there is a literature that's emerged over the last 10 years that playing nasty video games like this one, which is Medal of Honor, that you do not want your kids to play, is actually an incredibly good thing for increasing spatial and temporal resolution in your brain. Okay? So here you have all these people shooting at you, and you don't want to get killed, so you're trying to shoot back, and they're coming at you from all sides. And if you play these fast first-person action shooter video games, highly functional college kids will actually get better spatial and temporal resolution. Well, we're not going to give Medal of Honor to 7-year-old kids with developmental disabilities. That's not going to work. So to show you how committed I am to this research, I got my wife to buy me this game for Christmas. This is Raven Rabbids. And these guys you shoot toilet plungers at them. And if you can hit them on the head, you get extra points for them wandering around with a toilet plunger on their head. And you can see these 2 are almost identical pictures. Okay? Now, this is only a piece of Raven Rabbids. All the other stuff has no relevance to this phenomenon whatsoever. So there's little pieces of first-person shooter action in there. But I have a 6-year-old, and I tried to get him to play, and he hates it. And it's just way beyond him. So even this isn't going to work. So the point is, there could be transfer of this. That's our question. But there really are no games that only focus on spatial and temporal processing. Very quickly, we are interested in the underlying brain circuitry, and I don't want to spend much time simply saying that we've found a lot of specific circuitry that we think think is interesting and unusual in kids with the deletion. And one of the questions is there a way to understand changes in circuitry or even subgroups of kids with different kinds of circuitry that will again help us to break through the complexity? As you know, there's a very variable population. We want to try to find targeted interventions for different kinds of kids. So this is, I won't even go into a lot of detail, this is an incredibly complicated technique that we have. This is an important circuit in the brain that we think is very relevant, called the superior longitudinal fasciculus. You can ignore that for the moment. I just want to show you some phenomena. What you do is you basically put a beginning point and an end point into the brain anatomy in every single person's brain at an individual level. You say, try to track a space from here to here, and you give the brain imaging algorithm about 100,000 tries to find a good connection between the two. And this is a nice, healthy-looking brain from actually a healthy, typically developing child. And the algorithm finds the connections between this part and this part of the brain with about 88% accuracy, and says, no problem, we get this lovely clean mapping between these two things, okay? So that's an example of what we can get when this works very nicely, and so we can then relate that to different kinds of behaviors. This is Michelle Deng, who's a postdoc of mine in the lab. This is a child who has 22q deletion, and this is exactly the same track that we're trying to get hold of. And what you can see is we can find that connection. You see it's a whole lot wigglier than it is in the typical child, but instead of being that nice little circle, you can see there's just a mess of other stuff here. And in fact, only 13% of the fibers that we can find go through that track, and a whole load of them are going in other places. So this suggests that there's a lot of complex interplay between circuitry that just isn't so cleaned up. And it's possible, since connectivity changes across the lifespan, is very responsive to stimulation, that the kind of stimulations that we might be developing in these interventions might help us to concentrate and reduce some of the complexity in there. So another point we want to make up, and a lot of what you're going to hear today is going to be about this, so I want to say not too much about it. But we talked about attention, and that circuit, by the way, is very heavily involved in attention. So we talked about attention being sort of not as optimal as it could be, maybe because of crowding and for some other kinds of things. But in life, attending to salient important events or concepts and separating them from all the competing ones is a very important thing to do, okay? And salience is something that changes. So in math class, the teacher says, I want you to pay attention to what's on the board. That should be the most salient thing out there, okay? But it's driven by the external phenomena, like the teacher, but also internal phenomena. So the external things is what the teacher's writing on the board, but then there's also competing things, what the kid next to me is doing, okay? And, you know, the chair feels a bit funny. That's sort of a weird thing. And, you know, how comfortable am I? And then there's the internal things. Okay, how much do I want or need to understand this math? But how much does it make my head hurt or my tummy hurt being in this thing which is so difficult for me to understand? And of course, you know, for adults, it's things like, you know, how yummy does that cookie look, you know, when we're trying to diet? It suddenly kind of feels a little different than it did on a day when you're not trying to diet, okay? So stress and anxiety can alter the arousal and the salience when you really don't want to be eating cookies, but they're around you. They just look a whole lot yummier, and you just get a bit more hyped up about that, and you start noticing cookies all over the place. So the threshold for what enters your consciousness sort of drops, because that's a survival phenomenon. You're paying attention to more things because you're less comfortable and you're more aware of things. And so more things start competing for your already impaired attention. Okay, and so your spotlight of what to attend to gets pulled in all kinds of different directions when you really only want it to be in one place. And so nothing gets attended to long or deep enough for learning to really happen. And boy, you know, that looks a lot like ADHD, and there's a lot of ADHD in this population and other populations with disorders. So it may be that there's a strong relationship between stress and anxiety and ADHD, and this is a lifelong phenomenon, not just something that happens in children. So another thing we're doing is looking for subgroups in the data, and you'll hear more about this later, but you probably won't see this, and Michelle just showed me some of these things are like 3 days old, by the way, so I'm showing you stuff we even barely looked at. But this is a graph of an interesting visualization of a whole load of kids who've been through the lab. Every line is a particular child, and there's a score of their ADHD from very mild to red, very strong. And what you can see basically is that there's a whole bunch of children who have neither anxiety or ADHD. There's another group who have anxiety to mild to strong levels. There's a very tiny group that has ADHD without any anxiety, but the biggest group of all has both. So it does suggest there's a strong overlapping relationship between those things, and handling one will help us handle the other. Okay, so this is a slide you've seen from Joel Stoddard before. When we worried about things like anxiety and mood disorders that can be lifelong phenomena, or even psychotic disorders that maybe 20% of children will have when they become adults, or 25%. There are risk factors that are in red, but there are also blue things that are protective factors. So we know that there's a bunch of people who have no symptoms, to a bunch of people who are at risk, and some people have psychotic disorders and they can get cycled back, as well as people with anxiety and mood disorders and they can get cycled back. Okay, so some of the risk factors can be the genotype or the copy number variance, which is like a deletion or duplication, maternal distress in terms of in utero, rubella, encephalitis, those things can have an effect, hypoxia, CNS damage, so a lot of cardiac issues can also be factors in here. Anxiety disorders, cognitive impairment, allostatic load, which Elliot will probably talk about, that's carrying a heavier load of struggling to adjust all the time, and even things like autism symptoms that we think are extremely rare in this disorder but just keep getting labeled for probably the wrong reason. But there are also things like decline in verbal IQ, social withdrawal, substance use. These are all risk factors. But there are protective factors. We've talked now in our clinic about using selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, that can often help with stress and anxiety and depression. Atypical antipsychotics later on can be helpful. Cognitive behavioral therapy, good nutrition, like omega-3 fatty acids. These things can work to impact the protective factors as well, and you'll hear today a lot more about that stuff. So one thing that Michelle and Kathy have been doing together is to try and see if we can find subgroups in our population in a range of different ways. And one interesting range, this is very complicated in terms of the imagery. I really don't want you to try to understand the guts of this. I simply want to show you some pictures so you can appreciate some of our emerging understanding of what might be going on. We've looked back through a whole load of clinical issues from the kids, okay, and we've just tried to rate them from kind of basically totally healthy to some serious conditions. And when we do this, we found that, in fact, some things tend to group together. And if you just let a clustering algorithm in a statistical package look for groups, it actually finds about 3 groups here that are somewhat different from one another. So, for example, the group 1 and group 2 overlap quite a lot, as you can see by the fact that these orange boxes are quite the same in group 1 and 2, at least up here. And surgery and cardiac are going to be very tied up together because people who have serious cardiac have serious surgeries. But all I want you to see here is that we can actually find some groups, and the groups seem to be somewhat separable. So another way to look at it is that this finds a couple of different clusters with 2 major dimensions. These do not predict outcome. I just want you to understand this is not saying these are the healthy kids, these are not the healthy kids. It's sort of like who might be like each other, who might be different from one another, and then what can we use to understand that information to learn about. So here's a group here, the one I showed you before in that same color. I'm using the same colors as before. Here's one group, here's another group, and here's a third group. Now, when we just plonk on top of it how those factors that were in there, this is very messy, but what you can see is there's a group up here who has a big cardiac impact with a sort of an autoimmune component. Another group down here has failure to thrive and bad growth hormones and some things like hypocalcemia. And then this group here kind of splits across the other side. So they seem to be the ones without a lot of cardiac implications, but they've got things like VPI, some palatal issues, and cleft palate issues over here. But so it may be there's sort of different groups where these things contribute differently. One of our questions is, if kids are clustering together on some of these phenomena, will this help us to understand outcome? We've only been doing this a few days, and the answer right now is no, we aren't seeing any relationships. Maybe we haven't looked carefully enough and we're only just beginning this, but this is a way to help us break some of the complexity apart, look for subgroups, and see if we can find different responses for different groups of kids. So in the end, the way I like to look at this is that we care about positive outcomes, whether they're behavioral, psychiatric, educational, vocational, interpersonal, romantic, parenting. These kids are going to become parents, hopefully someday, some of them more suited than others. We have to figure all of that stuff out, right? So there's a lot in here. There's a genetics piece of this puzzle, and that affects things like heart and immune and brain, how that gets structured in the beginning, okay? There's a trauma piece. Let's face it, there's a lot of surgery and illness going on that can impact your development early on. There's even loss of family members, pets. These things can be difficult to challenge, especially if you have impairments. Okay, there's a cognition piece of this, how you're struggling or not in terms of academic learning, social cognition, practical everyday functioning. There's a community aspect to this. We're learning this is very important, how the family is supported and supports the child, how the school supports the family and the child, how friends and other folks provide supports and reduce stress and help actually function in everyday life. There's an affect part of this, your own levels of stress and fear and anxiety, high levels versus low levels seem to be interrelated. We hear a lot about this today. And finally, there's sort of a biological ongoing part, how the regulation of this biology affects all of this stuff and how gene expression can be changed by fear and anxiety or trauma, other kind of things like that. So there's an ongoing biological component. What we know is that even this complicated puzzle is not static. All of these things interrelate with one another constantly. We're now really able to integrate many research areas to head towards translation, which means telling you what the basic science means for some useful purpose, and moving towards intervention. We're talking about representational changes that underlie cognitive impairments, essentially crowding, and what kind of intervention we might develop there. Allostatic lobe, which is challenges of neurobiology of stress and anxiety and your responses to coping, the success and failure of that response. With and without family supports, community supports, how all of that goes along. Cognitive control changes and what are called schizophrenia-related symptoms. Not that those symptoms mean that you will end up with schizophrenia. It's very clear to us that you can have cognitive control issues and still not end up having schizophrenia. There's lots of factors there, so we want to understand what the intermediate risk and protective factors are so that we can, again, get into protection and intervention. And as I showed you, medical history and other subtyping explanations may help us to identify other further ideas about potential outcomes and what we can do. All of them, will be affected by things like your background genetics, because everybody is different from one another. The deletion is a modulator. It's not destiny. It changes who your developmental trajectory is going to be, what your developmental trajectory is going to be. Your experience. But if we combine all of these things, the basic and clinical research projects are starting to indicate ways to explain, treat, and possibly alter those outcomes. And that's what we're really trying to do. That's our mission going forward. And if you can help us, we can really, I think, move in a big way towards this.